Thank you once again, ladies. Very nice special music today. We all enjoyed that very much. And I actually had a nice surprise pulling in parking lot here today. There was a parking space set aside for the pastor. I don't know where they got that idea to do that, but certainly I didn't expect it, so I drove right by it. I didn't even know it was there. They had to come run me down and pull back into the parking spot there. So thanks very much to the parking crew for doing that here today. Well, as we know, the focus is on the teens on this particular service, Sabbath. We do appreciate their service today and the help that they're providing for us. As I mentioned as well, most importantly, their conduct, their involvement, their attitude, and the joy they are to work with the adults the many adults that work with our young people. We appreciate them as well. Yeah, teenage years are certainly a very challenging time in life. We all look back at that and remember that. It doesn't matter what age in which you live, though I think maybe sometimes now it's even more difficult. But everybody makes a transition from childhood to adulthood, and that's a challenge. Growing to that, being a responsible individual that stands on his or her own 2 feet, the sense of independence that comes as we progress from being small children to being young adults, actually, in our later teen years. Well, it's appropriate, I think, this particular time of year, the primary place that we'll look at here this afternoon, since it is nearing the Passover, we're going to take a look at a very unique 12-year-old, and this account is found in one of the Gospels. You probably know to what I'm referring. Each Gospel writer handles Jesus' life from a different emphasis and perspective. Same life, same story, same events, although some have some events others leave out and vice versa. But they're all looking at that special life, primarily the 3.5 years, with a few added things in the Gospels as well, but they all look at it from a different standpoint, a different dimension, you might say. The book of John, the Gospel, the fourth Gospel, the word Father is used more than all the other Gospels, because there's very much of a sense of intimacy between Jesus and his Father. We read those final words of Jesus in the book of John at the Passover and the prayer to his Father. John seems to emphasize that, the Son of God context, the divine element that's associated with Jesus in his life. So John, in his genealogy, as he looks back in history, goes back to, of course, begins in John chapter 1 and verse 1, and kind of a prehistory and how that impacts and ties in with Jesus and who he was and the Son of God and so on. Now, the book of Matthew talks about Jesus and emphasizes his being a king. His genealogy goes back to Abraham and Judah and David, which shows he legitimately can become the king of Israel. He goes back to David and to Judah, as I mentioned, and to Abraham, a rightful king through that line. Matthew 1:1, I'll read it if you don't want to turn there. It says, "This is the book of the generations of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." Yeah, the promises to Abraham, the scepter promises of the Messiah and the king over Israel. Well, he qualifies for that. His genealogy points that out. Matthew seems to emphasize a lot about being a king. Now, the book of Mark, he speaks of Jesus as a servant, more of what he did than what he taught or what he said. All of the things that he accomplished and many of the miracles, a little bit more than what he did than what he actually said. And of course, there's no genealogy in the book of Mark. There's no genealogy because you really don't need a genealogy to be a servant. Everybody's a servant. Everybody qualifies to be a servant. Jesus served mankind. Doesn't matter what his genealogy was or his past. He set the example of service. Well, then finally, the book of Luke deals with Jesus like a man. Ordinary individual, a human being, family life as well. He deals with his humanity, you might say. His birth, he covers his birth in chapter 2. Many of the details about that birth. His genealogy goes back not to Abraham. His genealogy goes all the way back through Mary, but it goes back through all the way back to Adam. Adam's the first man. Jesus, of course, is the last Adam. Luke chapter 3, verse 38. Luke 3:38. It speaks about his genealogy as Luke presents it. He was the son of Enos, which was the son of Seth, which was the son of Adam, which was the son of God. The human dimension, the human side of things. Mary's line, his birth mother. So in the Gospels we have a son, we have a king, we have a servant, and we have a man. All Jesus Christ, all about his 3.5-year ministry, and a little bit of other things added as well. So it's the story in Luke's account that we'll look at today. And we'll see many typical family dynamics that take place in this short account in the book of Luke. Now, as I mentioned before, Jesus, his name was Yeshua, or something similar to that, however they pronounced it. We would say Joshua today. That was his name. That's what he was known. He was Joshua, the son of Joseph. His name wasn't Jesus Christ. Christ is a designation of what he fulfilled, the Messiah, the christened one. So he was Joshua to his family, to his friends. I don't know if they called him Josh or not. They did that in those days, but he was Joshua. It was a common name, and he had a normal childhood. Relatively speaking, we would say that he had a normal childhood. In Mark chapter 13, verse 55, Mark 13:55. Now, of course, none of us were there throughout the entirety of his childhood to see to what degree he differed from others, but it wasn't evident to anybody that he was anything but a regular child in most respects. Matthew 13:55, when Jesus is doing all of these things in his ministry, well, now he was certainly distinct, but that was his time. Growing up was not. In Matthew 13:55, well, isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother called Mary? His brethren are here, James and Joseph and Simon and Judas, and isn't that kid? In other words, there was nothing unusual about him. Well, they didn't say, well, yeah, that's that boy that used to do all those miracles all the time. Well, that's that boy that could recite the whole Bible. Well, there weren't any things like that. Apparently not. Because they seemed to think, well, isn't that Joseph and Mary's boy? Who's doing all this teaching? All these miracles? Nothing apparently stood out in that way. Jesus wasn't going down to the swimming hole with his friends and they jumped in, and he just walked on the water or something like that. It wasn't that kind of experience from anything that we can get from the Scriptures. So we would say it would be generally a normal experience. He had friends, did the things young people do growing up, developing their physical body and learning and growing and all of the things. He had friends that were guys, and he had girls that were friends as well. That would only be normal. His appearance and his actions would not have necessarily been out of the ordinary, other than, we would say, his attitude and his heart. I guess we could throw in there as, the spiritual dimension. But otherwise, it wouldn't have been that abnormal. Look at Isaiah 53, verse 2. Isaiah 53, verse 2. Sometimes we read this around the Passover time. Isaiah 53, verse 2. He shall grow up before him as a tender plant, speaking of Christ, and as a root out of dry ground. He has no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there's no beauty that we should desire him. He didn't stand out like a movie star. He wasn't of a height as King Saul, where Saul was towering above everybody. He just fit in many respects like a normal man once he grew up, and he would have been a normal child as well. In other words, everybody didn't stop and say, well, look at that boy walking there, or look at that man. According to this, doesn't have any particular form. He's not so built that he's muscle-bound and it's so distinct from everybody. He would have been a kind of normal-looking Jewish man. Matter of fact, he needed help in being identified at times. So that's a little glimpse at that, and trying to grasp, because obviously we weren't there, and I wasn't. Don't pretend to know it all about his childhood. But why don't we go back to Luke chapter 2 and read this account? And it's one for both young people as well as parents. So we're in Luke chapter 2. This is the book of Luke where he deals with a lot of the things dealing with Christ and his humanity and what those experiences are like. So in verse 41, now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And it wasn't too long ago that I commented on this, the aspect of parents teaching their children, going to a church service and a worship service. So Jesus obviously got very important training in his family experience, along with his brothers and sisters as well. And they were taught that they had a spiritual obligation. That's what Joseph and Mary taught their children. A duty and responsibility spiritually. They would learn the concept of a creator. And this is what people learn if they go to church. There must be a God. There must be a creator God. There must be right and wrong. There must be what God expects to see. These things used to be promoted more in schools. As a matter of fact, they're very much early on in our history a part of the whole education system. The Christian faith and right and wrong and a lot of those principles. And you wonder to what degree we're getting that in the schools today. I don't think anywhere near the way it used to be. Many want to push all of that out of the schools. Well, general things. I don't mean church doctrines. The golden rule that comes from the Bible. It's better to give than receive. And serving other people. And we're made in the image of God. We're not animals. We're made in God's image. And on. The things you learn in most any religious context, not talking about doctrine. Are the young people getting that today? I think they're getting more of the spirit of the world, don't you? Look at 1 Corinthians 2:12. We'll come back here to Luke chapter 2. 1 Corinthians 2:12. I think more and more, it's not hard to see, what the young people are taking in are not fundamental sound spiritual principles as much as whatever the prevailing thinking is. Now we have received not the spirit of the world. Well, that's a theme this time of year. The Exodus, coming out of Egypt, coming out of the world, separating yourself, God leading his people, teaching them. So we've not received the spirit of the world. Education used to kind of combat that more negative satanic spirit. The kids would get that in school when they're little readers and they begin to read about fundamental, we'd call them Christian values. Of course, we were a Christian nation. We don't want that around anymore, it seems. Well, 1 John 2:15, again, one we might read in one context or another at this time of year. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. Don't love it just because it's popular, it's trendy. This is what we're saying. It's how we're looking. Love not the world, neither the things in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in them. We'll read in John 17, Passover night, where Jesus said, they are not of the world, even as I'm not of the world. Well, we live here, but our mind isn't in the world. We don't dwell here in our heart, our spiritual mindedness. And you can write down 2 Timothy chapter 4. Unfortunately, this individual, 2 Timothy 4:10, for Demas, Paul is writing, Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world. Now, what is it he loved? Well, it doesn't say. Maybe he had a chance to make a lot of money. Maybe he had a chance to be somebody important. Maybe there was some temptation, some pleasure. But it was something the world had to offer that he turned and went back to it. There's always that danger, like Israel wanting to go back to Egypt after God had taken them out. Well, religious training, I'd say most all religious training, unless it's something really strange, would provide some kind of spiritual nourishment, some kind of spiritual direction of a greater being that has created us. There's a right and a wrong. Now here's a study from a John Bartkowski from Mississippi State University. He's a sociologist, and he just concludes here. This is what he found in his studies. The kids whose parents regularly attend religious services. So from a small age, young children, they see they're in church. This is where you go and you learn about God. And they see the adults, they see the men, they see the women. It's not just a church filled with old women, sentimental old women. The men are there, the women are there, the teens are there. And from an early age, there's a concept. There's a God. You worship God. You hear about God. The kids whose parents regularly attend religious services, especially when both parents did so frequently, and talked with their kids about religion, were rated by both parents and teachers in his study as having better self-control. Sure, that's a principle of life. Controlling oneself, so they would have better, the kids that went to church, doesn't say which church, didn't matter. They had better self-control, better social skills. Here we are, especially in this congregation, a lot of people, kids learn to be around a good-sized group of people, and they're not as intimidated by that. They learn how to greet somebody, how to say hello to somebody, how to talk to others that are not in their family. So they have better social skills and approaches to learning than kids with non-religious parents. Well, of course, Jesus' parents went up to the Passover every year, with, of course, so many others as well. So there's an important dimension of that. Are our young people getting that kind of thing today? Well, the churches are kind of declining, at least in some respects. And, of course, what society is pumping out in the way of values and principles and false claims about what makes you happy and what doesn't, and what's life all about, and is there a God, or did we evolve, and all the rest of it, a tremendous amount, counteracting anything spiritual. Well, of course, again, God knew what he was doing when he picked out Joseph and Mary to rear the Messiah. So this is what Jesus' family did, he and his brothers and sisters. And we don't have a lot of information, but for some reason, here's an account when he was 12 years old. I don't have a series of here's what he did all the way up and after that. Just one glimpse, age 12, one set of circumstance. There must be some important lessons here. Okay, let's go back to Luke chapter 2 again. Verse 43. So his parents went up to Jerusalem every year at the feast of Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast, of course. Now, when they had fulfilled the days, the feast was now over, it's time to go back home, and they returned. The child Jesus tarried behind in Jerusalem, and Joseph and his mother didn't realize it. Now, we can probably begin to make a few deductions, even though it's not stated here. So they had on Joseph and Mary and the other kids. Must have been at least 6 of them in the family other than Jesus. Apparently, didn't we just read about 4 of the boys and his sisters? So I guess 6 others. So they're heading back, and Jesus stays back in Jerusalem. Well, you have to conclude that Jesus must have had a level of independence, or a certain amount of trust, or a certain amount of confidence Joseph and Mary had, that they didn't have to hold his hand or make sure he was right next to them, because he's a 12-year-old and entering into the teen years and as a young man, and he's certainly very responsible, so they felt undoubtedly very confident about him. You could at least deduct that, I think, without without stretching it too much in thinking about that. So he had a certain amount of, I guess we could call it space as a young man, and parents assuming that he probably came down to the feast, maybe with other family, other friends, which would be normal, and, well, he's probably going to go back with the same ones, and we saw him talking with them and whatever, and they just assumed that that's what was happening. So he had a certain amount of, obviously, independence in that limited sense, and this, of course, is the challenging dynamic for any parents. Certainly was for Judy and I, is for any parent, that dynamic of having the proper oversight and being watchful and restricting and guiding our young people, the guidance from parents, but also giving space and letting go so the kids learn to stand on their own 2 feet. There's a certain separation from mom as dad as they grow older. That's the natural process. And it changes as young people get older. Too often in the world today, parents sometimes are just too detached. You might say push the kids to grow up too fast, push them into circumstances, especially male and female or romantic circumstances. They're nowhere near ready for that, not getting the right guidance, but society's pushing it. And sometimes parents do, and there's not the proper oversight, maybe of dating and getting off on their own and that aspect of it as well. Too much of the pop culture too early. And a lot of it being, of course, very negative. Of course, there's the other extreme of being too watchful, too overprotective, too attached, to where a young person doesn't feel like they're growing up and making some decisions. It's a very difficult, challenging dynamic in every family. Nobody does it perfectly that I've ever met. Certainly I didn't. Sometimes the church helps out with this, and our camps contribute to that, and occasionally it can be rather traumatic in our preteen camp, because here we have 6 and 7-year-old kids. They're pretty young. And so here's mom and dad, they come on a Sunday and drop the 6 or 7-year-old off, and they'll be back on Wednesday. And they're not calling or talking to them. And sometimes that's the first step for a parent, and that is a difficult step to take, because there just has not been ever that kind of separation, unless maybe they stayed with a relative or something for a day. But to drop them off and on Sunday, and we'll see you, goodbye, we'll see you Wednesday, and we won't talk to you till then, and you're 7 or 6. I think it starts at 6 in some cases as well. That's a challenging step for parents to experience that. We've seen it over the years. Some on the other hand will keep them a week if you want to. You can go ahead and keep them all week. Generally, though, it can be a difficult if you're saying goodbye for those few days. But that's a necessary thing. I don't mean it's necessary for you to send your child to preteen camp. That in itself isn't. But I just mean the eventual growth of individuals standing on their own and having a separation from mom and dad for their own development. That is necessary for both parent and children in the right way and in the right use of wisdom doing that. We've told sometimes the young people, how do you get your parents to do what you want them to do? How do you get your parents to do what you want them to? Well, you show them you're trustworthy. Show them you're dependable. Show them you're trustworthy. And you'll be surprised how much then they will begin to trust. And they should then reward some of that with a certain amount of trust. But you have to act responsibly. But everybody has to learn how to do that. Sometimes we've all heard the stories of people, young people finally getting off on their own, whether it's school or whether it's some kind of other event, and they just don't have the good sense of judgment because of that. So we all, whether it's teens or adults, we all have to pray for that wisdom that comes. and that dynamic in the family. So some of this is taking place, obviously, in Mary and Joseph and Jesus' life. Because the mom and dad head back home from the feast. Jesus isn't with them, and they're fine with that. He's obviously with somebody else. Verse 44. But they, supposing him to have been in the company, went a full day's journey, and they sought him among their kinsfolk and acquaintance. So it sounds like going up to the feast, or from up in the Galilee area in Nazareth, you went up to the feast. It's upper elevation in Jerusalem. Different groups would travel. Families sometime together, or neighborhoods, and you would go, and this group would go, and they would go. And coming down, it was probably Jesus was with, as it says here, some of his kinfolk and acquaintances, his friends. And obviously, they would have been with Jesus during the feast, and well, it's time to go, and they're just assuming. So it sounds like, in verse 45, when they found him, they turned back again to Jerusalem. So the group, it sounds like they thought he was with a group. The group is probably ahead of them. When they finally, after the end of the day, they get there and said, oh, well, where's Jesus? We're going to have dinner together. Where's Jesus? Well, we don't know. He didn't come with us. So they, of course, obviously, that was a shock to them. Thought they were with friends and relatives of some one type or another. So now, obviously, they're rather shocked at that. They found him not. Well, they've got to go back to Jerusalem. They probably go around and ask, you seen Jesus? No, we didn't see him. Well, I thought he was with you. Well, no, he wasn't with us, and he's not here. Well, what are any parents? They're going to be afraid. They're going to be very concerned. So back to Jerusalem we go. Now, if you travel the whole day, I suppose they didn't go until the next morning, would seem to make sense. But they got another whole day to go back to find him. So that's the set of circumstances, I should say. They're very worried about it. He is only 12, and they have a normal concern from everything you can read here. It doesn't appear as though Joseph was saying, now, Mary, come on, don't worry a bit. If anybody tries to give him trouble, he'll call down lightning. He'll call down fire. We don't have a thing to worry about. Well, it wasn't that kind of upbringing. Apparently, that type of thing did not happen. They were genuinely worried for any 12-year-old. He's a full day's journey. They don't know what happened to him. So they're heading back. So we pick it up then in verse 46. So it came to pass after 3 days now, they traveled a day, took a day to come back, and maybe it was evening and they didn't see him. So now we're on the third day. Came to pass that after 3 days, there he was in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. And of course, all that heard him were astonished at his understanding and his answer. Obviously, a very exceptional, what they would view as a very exceptional 12-year-old. His grasp of the Scriptures, spiritual questions, things about the law, things about their history, about God, and they were astonished. But this 12-year-old, his scriptural perception of things, but amazing, I'm sure, to be a part of that. And listen to that. No question about him being an outstanding individual, but apparently not just pulling off one miracle after another. So there he is. They come back. They've looked for him. Doesn't say how long during the day it took them to finally find him, but he's back there in the temple. And so now when his parents in verse 48, when they saw him, they were, of course, amazed at that for a number of reasons. And his mother said unto him, Son, why have you thus dealt with us? Behold, your father and I have sought you sorrowing. So they were of course, puzzled by what took place and why he did that. They didn't expect that. I guess we could say in one sense, as we'll learn, Mr. Hoy had that sermon last week about being aligned on this issue. Joseph and Mary and Jesus were not exactly aligned with what the expectation was on either side. Doesn't mean somebody did something wrong. It's just they weren't quite aware of what the other one was thinking at that time. Now, this is a very key parental response. It says that when they saw him, they were amazed, puzzled, didn't understand why he wasn't with the rest of the group. So Mary says to him, "Son, why have you thus dealt with us? Behold, your father and I have sought you sorrowing." The very key parental response in that she first expressed how she and Joseph felt. And they ask him, "Can you explain yourself," in essence? In other words, what often happens is the parents are angry. They're worried. And so they have all that emotion. Then they travel the whole day, traveling all the way back. It's 3 days now. So the parents are upset. Generally, would be normal parents, or most often, perhaps most. They would be angry, and then they make an accusation. "You're grounded, Buster. You're in trouble." First thing, you're in trouble. But they didn't do that. It wasn't an emotional response. They had emotions. They were afraid. But it wasn't just an emotional response. They didn't take Jesus' cell phone immediately. There's no account of that, them doing that. They didn't make accusations. "You don't care about your parents staying behind like you only think about yourself. Oh, you never trust me and you never think I can," and back and forth. Doesn't that sound familiar in family dynamics? Some anger, the emotions, you're this and you're that, and you've been back and forth. Next thing you know, somebody's slamming a door and going in their room, and they didn't handle it that way. They had emotions. They obviously, she said, "We've been sorrowing, we've been worrying, and fretting about that." But she explains that to him. It's very important that both individuals, both the parents and the children, understand the intent. So Mary, speaking, probably the one more distraught and worried than Dad, or at least his father, and our guardian, obviously. But so she's speaking. "We were very worried, very sorrowful. We sought you sorrowing. What's your story? What happened? Tell us." Before they do anything, tell us. What were you thinking? And then he said unto them, "Well, how is it that you sought me? Didn't you realize that I must be about my Father's business?" That's what I meant by that. At that moment, they weren't totally aligned in trying to understand where each was coming from exactly. But it's important to know that. The child has to understand the parental perspective. And the parents have to understand, what were you thinking? We've heard that. What were you thinking? What are they thinking? What's going through their mind? I've made that mistake. You have. I've already figured it out and accused them. Well, you were trying to do, I know what you were trying to do in that. And, well, Dad, this is what happened. Oh, well. That's different. We should find that out first before we make a judgment. So she's doing that, and they both are. So Jesus was honest about it. Nobody did something wrong. Things happen in life. And there were some assumptions and didn't understand. So Jesus basically said, "Well, I'm kind of puzzled. We've talked about my birth, and Mom, you've explained that to me, and we said how, I've got a special purpose here, and God's going to use me in this way, or whatever conversation. I just assumed when I didn't come back, I'm 12. 12 is kind of a time of entering into, beginning to think of adulthood and growing, and that is a demarcation age. Many societies, age 12, the beginning of maturity and personal identity. 12 is even a number of government in some ways in the Bible. So he wasn't 11, he wasn't 13. Maybe 12 is really significant. So he's basically, as I read it, well, I'm kind of puzzled as to why you were so upset. I figured you would have thought, well, of course he has an important responsibility. He's probably down there talking to the doctors of the law in the temple, of course. But he thought that perhaps they would understand that, apparently more than obviously they did with a 12-year-old. Now in verse 50, so how is it that I thought that you would just conclude that I had started and thinking about my responsibility. Well, they didn't really understand exactly what he was getting at, and they didn't understand how that fit into the context of their lives and what that meant he felt he should be doing and how that would change, and they weren't able to put that all together with Jesus at this point in his life. Now, we don't ever hear of Joseph again after this. So he dies. And we don't know when he died. We don't know how old Jesus was. Obviously, he was dead before his ministry began. Didn't we read? Well, I read that verse about, well, isn't this, the carpenter's son? But then there was another occasion that your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside. It didn't say his father. So Joseph dies sometime before Jesus' ministry. Don't know how old everybody was. Obviously, that would have been very sorrowful for the family. He was a good man. They loved Joseph. I'm sure Jesus loved Joseph as well. He knew who his real father was, but Joseph was his guardian and the only physical guardian that he had growing up, and they loved each other. It was very sad when Joseph died. He was probably older than Mary. When Jesus' ministry began, he was 30. Mary, let's say she would be 20, maybe between 20 and 30 when the angel appeared to her. So she's in her 50 or between 50 and 60, somewhere in there, I suppose. Joseph probably an older man than Mary was, so maybe he simply lived out his life, and he was more elderly, and for some reason he passed away. It was a very sad event for the entire family, I'm sure. Now, verse 51 is again instructional as well. We're trying to read between the lines, and I'm certainly not implying that every comment I make is exactly the way it was. Trying to glean some things from what we appear to be reading. So verse 51, and he, Jesus, went down with them and came to Nazareth and was subject unto them, but his mother kept all these things in his heart. Now, it is curious. It doesn't say, and so Jesus went back home with them. Now, it does say that, but it says he went down with them back home to Nazareth after their conversation, after their discussion. He didn't say, well, I've got my Father's business. I'm staying here in Jerusalem. Didn't say that. I'm sure they had a longer discussion. How long, we don't know, and a give and take, and what Mary and Joseph are thinking, and how they're viewing it, and Jesus hearing them, and them hearing Jesus. No account here of him being punished for anything, which he wouldn't need to be. He went down with them, and another was subject unto them. It doesn't say he just went home. Being subject to them seems to speak of a mindset. Not that he was not subject before, or he was in some way disobedient, and now he went home and he was going to be obedient, but he placed himself under their authority, or at least reconfirmed that at age 12. He went with them and was subject. They're the parents, he's the 12-year-old child. He thought about doing his father's business, and that was honorable, what he was doing. Certainly was a marvel to the people at the temple, but he must have realized, well, my role right now is to be a son, not to start my ministry at age 12. Somehow there was some realization, well, I'll go back home. I'm subject to mom and dad. That's what I need to be doing now. Not getting started in my role as the Messiah. So he would have had a sharper focus, I think we could conclude, and his parents would have as well, in fine-tuning his awareness and his mission and so on. Jesus wouldn't be ready to really enter his Father's business, that of being the Savior and Messiah, for another 18 years, where he reached a level of maturity at age 30, still a very young man, but fasting 40 days and 40 nights, so 18 more years. So he decided, well, I'm going back home. I'm subjecting myself as I ought to my parents. And that's the context. And we don't hear anything more about Jesus until age 30. Nothing more about his life. Just this one little story. But it seems as though there was growth, there was learning, there was seeing, there was interaction, a dynamic among the family. Really an excellent example of that. So the 18 years between now and his ministry is going to be a time of preparation, growth, maturity. That's what youth is for. That's what life is for. Young people are to prepare for their future in a variety of ways, whether it's schooling or training in some type, preparing for when you're totally on your own, standing on your own 2 feet. Experience growth and maturity. That's what youth is for. Growing and develop. Parents try to aid that, try to guide, try to pull back when it's going too fast, or try to encourage when somebody needs to step out and do that and learn and mature and grow. Very challenging, as I mentioned, for all parents. Well, Luke 2, verse 52, Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. We must not have had all wisdom. How can you increase in wisdom if you already had it all? Well, he experienced things, and the experience gave him wisdom and grasp and understanding, as it would the next 18 years before he launched into his ministry. Hebrews 5 and verse 8 implies this growth process. This was a experience obviously guided by the Spirit of God, which he had without measure, it says in the next chapter of Luke, actually. But still there was a learning process. Hebrews 5:8, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience. There was a learning process. There was a developing. There was a grasping. So as a high priest now, it says, well, he understands our infirmities. He understands circumstances. Things that he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. So this experience of all things, here's the Passover. The time of the Passover. The time of kind of an orienting ourselves again. And grasping things or maybe seeing things. This happens to be the time of the Passover. What's the definition of wisdom? It said Jesus grew in the wisdom, the quality of having experience. His experience, like anybody, helped him to know things. Never sinned, that's true. He didn't experience doing evil. Still experienced and grew in knowledge. Good definition of wisdom, the quality of having experience, knowledge, good judgment. Quality of being wise. If we were only all wiser, we can look back at things we've all done. Oh, why did I do that? I forget that saying, how it goes, is wisdom is so you stop making mistakes. How do you get wisdom? You make mistakes. Seems to be the way it works, unfortunately. Proverbs 9 and verse 10. Proverbs 9:10. We're finished then in Luke chapter 2, I believe, where it says Jesus increased in wisdom and stature from his experiences. Proverbs 9, verse 10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning. You want to begin having some kind of sense, the fear of the Lord. So if a child's being taken to a church where they teach moral values, they teach about God, there's a degree of wisdom where when they get out into the world, they don't just think everything that the world's doing and everything that's popular is what I need to dive into. They have some wisdom about themselves. They've heard spiritual values, contrasting the way Satan's world paints fun and joy and fulfillment and what it really means. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Once we begin to have the right fear of God, then we say, well, now we're wising up. Well, finally, starting to wise up. Our values are not what we make them. The values come from God. Well, let's finish the time that we have here in looking at Jesus' of course, important statement. Here he is at age 12 with the sense at that age that he's on a mission. He has a purpose. I must be about my Father's business. We are all to be doing that, not just Jesus. Young people as well. That's a saying for all of us. We should be about our Father's business, not our own business first and foremost. Now that takes on an added magnitude when we're baptized because you step into that covenant of committing to the Father's business, whereas when you're growing up and leading into baptism, you're doing that, you're convicted of it, but baptism seals that. It begins the judgment. You're a full disciple. But it doesn't matter, we're all doing that. Psalm 71 verse 5, Psalm 71, 5. Psalm 71, 5, for you have been my hope, David says, sovereign Lord, my confidence since my youth. Since my youth. I've had the awareness of God, God's values, spiritual values, right and wrong. Our young people, young children and teens are able to experience that. Well, what is that business? Okay, we're about our Father's business. What's that? What is that business? None of us have been anointed to preach glad tidings and to heal the brokenhearted and give sight to the blind. No, we don't have that business to do. Jesus did at 30. That was the time. His mother even asked him at Canaan, well, they ran out of wine. He says, it's not my time yet. Why are you asking me this? Well, she said, fill it with water. I have a hunch he's going to do something. But even then he wasn't quite sure it was time. It was the right timing. He learned that at 12. So none of us are anointed to preach good tidings, to give our life for mankind. We can't even contemplate the responsibility that he had. So what is our business? For young people, how about Ephesians chapter 1? Young people, Ephesians chapter 1 through 3. Ephesians 6, 1 through 3. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. This is right. Yeah, that's your father's business. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. You want to get your parents to do what you want them to do with respect to you? Well, show them you're obedient. Show them you honor them. Try to understand where they're coming from, the parental role. Then it goes both ways in verse 4. Okay, fathers or guardians, parents, don't provoke your children. You're going to have wisdom. Wisdom in who they are as an individual. Maybe their personality is not like you. Maybe they don't have your likes, your strengths, or your talents. They're themselves. You've got to deal with who they are. You've got to deal in wisdom, in the space and in the guidance and the direction. So if not, then that becomes, as it seems to say here, provoking a response. Sometimes anger, frustration. It takes a lot of God's help to do that. So that's one way of saying, well, what's our Father's business? How about Matthew chapter 22, verse 36? We could, of course, go through the entire Bible if we wanted to. Well, what's our Father's business for us? But this is the time of year we are told to come back and take a good look at that. What's the Father's business for you? What did we say it was? What did we accept? This is the time of year we look at that. Decide whether we want to keep doing the Father's business or whether we've had enough. I think I'll do my own this year. I'll be off in my own business. Father's business, Matthew 22:36. Master, which is the great commandment of the law. Well, the Father's business for us is that we love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind. That's the first commandment. The second's like it. We love our neighbor. So what's the Father's business? Love God and His way. Love your neighbor. That's what we're about doing. Best of our ability, of course, with God's help. Jesus at age 12. I just assumed, Mom and Dad, that you would figure that at 12, I'm 12 now, and I'd be talking to all these doctors of the law at the temple. That's how much his responsibility, even at age 12, was. Well, Micah chapter 6, we're just reading a few verses here and reminder as to, well, what's the Father's business? I got to be about my Father's business. Or maybe say to some, that's in our own mind, maybe not to them. Well, that's not my Father's business right there. I don't have anything to do with that. Micah 6:8. He's shown you, O man, what's good. What's God require of us? What's His business for us? Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with God. So if we're not just with people, honest and just, forthright, if we hate being merciful, we're not humble, we're not doing the Father's business. That's what the world does. God's business is that we're just, we love mercy when we can apply it, when it's called for. We love mercy, and we're humble before God, not boasting about our goodness or accomplishments. If we don't do that, well, neglecting the Father's business. James 1, verse 27. James 1:27. Let me read this to you, and then we'll go to two others to conclude. James 1:27, pure religion undefiled before God and the Father is this. Okay, what's His business? To visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction, to give when there's not going to be an expectation of getting something in return. We're givers. Don't just throw our money away. We're not frivolous about it. We use sense, good judgment, but we're still giving people. Here it mentions it would be the fatherless and the widow. You're not going to get anything back from them. They don't have anything. So it's to visit them, to have that kind of attitude, keep ourselves unspotted from the world. Oh, here's the latest thinking. Here's the latest dress. Here's the latest activity. Here's the latest whatever. May not want that. Children grow up in a religious home. They learn there's the world, and everything about it isn't necessarily good, popular or not. You get that principle. A lot of people growing up, they're into whatever is popular, whatever's being done. Get on board or be thought of as stupid or strange. But learning the right thing, wait a minute, let's analyze this. I know everybody's doing it, saying it. Is that good? Is that beneficial? Not as many are getting that concept, I don't think. Two more verses. Here's a very important one, 1 Peter 2. 1 Peter 2, 21. What's the Father's business? Now, this is a tough one. 1 Peter 2, not second. For even hereunto we were called to God's business. Well, what's that? Well, Christ suffered for us. Sometimes we have to as well. He didn't sin. Neither was guile found in His mouth, even when He was being crucified. Who, when He was reviled, He didn't give the same in return. That wasn't the Father's business. They give it to you, give it back twice as much. That's not the Father's business. When He suffered, He threatened not. He committed Himself to Him that judges rightly. That's the Father's business. We commit our lives to Him. And so we bear our mistakes his own body on the tree, that we might, being dead to sin, would be able to have life through that sacrifice and through the stripes that were on his body. For you were a sheep going astray, but are now returned unto the shepherd and bishop of your soul. That's the Father's business, that when even we do something and we do it right and we suffer for it, we take it without retaliating. Yeah, it says it in verse 20. What glory is it when you're buffeted for your faults, you take it patiently? What else can you do? You had it coming. But if and when you do well and suffer and take it patiently, now that's the Father's business. We're not going out and preaching on the corner street, not trying to win people over for Christ. That's not the business we're called to do. I'm not either. This kind of thing is that business. So we'll conclude in Ephesians chapter 3. I hope we have appreciated it. One story, all of the Gospels, all of the events in Jesus' life. There he was, age 12. This family dynamic that took place. Jesus, aware of who he was, learning from the experience, as well as his parents, and how they handled it, what we learn about him and the family. So Ephesians chapter 3, 3 verses here, 4 verses beginning in verse 16. Father's business, that he would grant you according to the riches of his glory to be strengthened with might by his Spirit in the inner man. That's the Father's business. Be strengthened internally. That Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith. That's the business. That's the Father's business. That you being rooted and grounded in love may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth, the length, and the depth, and the height. That's the business we're doing. To know the love of Christ, which passes knowledge, that you might be fulfilled with all the fullness of God. Now unto him that is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we would ask or think, according to the power that works in all of us. Let's remember this example of a 12-year-old boy, in many respects, as Luke deals with the human element in his life. And let's make sure we're all about reconfirming being about our Father's business.